This segment is all about understanding your camera and how to determine a correct exposure. Now, what is the best way to actually understand any tool? Well, that is read the manual. If I was to ask you at home watching right now, have you read your camera manual from cover to cover? You would probably say no. Please do yourself a favor and read the camera manual. It could be one thing that you learn that's a little bit different, one little nuance that can mean the difference between a good picture and a great picture. And I'm telling you, it makes it a lot more fun. I can't tell you the last couple of decades that I've been teaching. I'll be teaching with someone, a student with a similar camera system, and I'll just rattle off under my breath a particular technique that uses these combination of buttons, and they'll look at me like I'm an alien. And I'm like, well, you've read your camera manual, right? And they'll look at me sort of blankly with a wry smile. It is no different than when you're playing, let's say, a video game. Give you an example, like a Mortal Kombat. You may have heard of it. It's a PlayStation game and all those kinds of things. You might select your favorite player, and then you're fighting in a little bit of a battle, and a combination of buttons can give you like countless number of moves. Now, most people who are novices, like myself, will go in there and maybe just tap a few buttons and just have some fun, and you want to get into the game really quickly. You don't want to do the research. Then all of a sudden, that particular favorite player of yours can only go so far. And then you realize that you can't beat a more experienced player because they know all the moves. So what you want to do is read those particular moves, what that player is capable of, and now you can have a lot more fun. No different than in photography. We want to be able to understand what the camera is capable of. No different than a calculator to an accountant. Now, when we talk about exposure, and we're talking about a camera system, of course, we'll do this in practice very shortly. Right now, I just want to give you a little bit of theory to sort of give us a bit of a foundation to work from. So when we give you our practical demonstrations, excuse me, when we give you our practical demonstrations in the field, then you'll have something to reference to. So let's talk about it now. Is exposure and the way the camera works anything new? What came before it? Well, the human eye is so complex and is so incredible that we have to understand that it all stemmed from this. So let me explain. If you're looking at the pupil of the eye, the iris of the eye, let's call it the aperture of the eye. Basically, we're allowing light to come into our eyes so we can recognize the environment around us. So the aperture of the eye, the iris, is allowing light to come in. You'll often hear about your pupils being dilated. That's basically meaning the aperture of the eye is wide open. We're allowing all that light to flood in. Like you may have an operation with your eyes, for example, and you'll get your pupils dilated deliberately, and they're really wide open, allowing that light to flood in, and then you walk outside and it's all sunny and you can't see. Well, that's like photographing, for example, at an f-stop at 1.2 or 1.4, where the aperture is really, really wide open. Now let's talk about shutter speed. Well, that's like your eyelid. That's like basically how long you keep your eyes closed or not. For example, if you blink quickly, that is like a fast shutter speed. You're allowing light to travel in quickly. And if you keep your eyes open, well, that's basically like putting it on a fraction of a second, like maybe a half a second or 1 second. Or even, for example, sometimes you're photographing landscapes and you want to shoot at f22 with a deep depth of field. We'll discuss more of that shortly. But that basically means that we're maybe shooting at 1 second or 5 seconds or 10 seconds. That's like leaving your eyelid open for quite a while. Now, what about ISO? Well, ISO, I liken in the human eye to, let's say, the aging process. So, for example, myself, as of this video tutorial that I've been filming, it's 2020. I'm 46 years of age as of this moment. Now, as I'm getting older, of course, I see less detail. Things are less sharp. Well, that's exactly the same with ISO. So, for example, as you age, you see less detail, less dynamic range, and all those different things. And that is pretty much what ISO is. The younger you are, the cleaner everything looks, the less sandy, the less noisy, the less grainy, and all those types of things. So once we understand the combination of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, then we truly begin to understand what exposure is all about. But this just quick little visual reference is that, just to let you know, the human eye can do all that the camera does and even more. and whether you believe in God, creation, evolution, whatever it basically is, doesn't really matter. The human eye gives us that perfect foundation to discuss what exposure is all about. Now, you've probably heard of the exposure triangle. What does that mean? Well, let's go through it properly now. The exposure triangle. Okay, so we've got three things that determine exposure. Basically, we have the ISO, that is the image sensor's sensitivity to light. We have shutter speed, that's the exposure time. So we said ISO was like the aging process, like the quality that we're getting. Shutter speed is the exposure time, how long we're actually keeping our eyes open, so to speak. And the aperture controls the amount of light on the sensor and how much is in focus. And we call that depth of field. So let's focus on ISO, for example. Now, of course, there's lots more ISOs that we can use in the current camera systems, but for the moment, let's start from 100 ISO, 200, 400, 800, all the way up to 12,800 and beyond. When we get to this level, okay, we need less light. In other words, we will be shooting in dark situations. We need less light. There's less detail, though, unfortunately. There's less sharpness, less dynamic range. And of course, we get more noise and grain. So ideally, you don't really want to be up in this sort of level when you're photographing, but sometimes you simply need to, because you may be in the crypt of a church, you can't shoot with flash, we're shooting with candlelight, and we're going to have to use these ISOs. Let's go down to this end of the scale. When you're thinking about 100 ISO, we need more light. When we say we need more light, if we have more light, then we can shoot with 100 ISO. More detail, we have more sharpness, more dynamic range, and of course less noise or grain. So you'll often read textbooks about ISO when we talk about 100 ISO being something like maybe in the sun, 400 ISO maybe being in the shade, maybe indoors being at 1600. And then as it gets darker and we have less ambient light filtering through the windows of a house, so if we're only using ambient light in terms of man-made tungsten light or fluorescent light or whatever we're doing inside, or candlelight, then that's when we have to go up to this end of the scale. Now let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically how long that particular eye is open, or the camera's eye, the aperture, and how much light we let in, and the exposure time. So we look at exposures from anywhere from 1 second to multiple seconds to what we call bulb, where we get to manually choose how long that particular shutter speed is open. We've got half a second, quarter of a second, 8th, 15th, 30th, 60th, 125, 250, 500 and beyond. And of course, most camera systems will go up to 8,000. So we often talk about a safe handheld shutter speed. For most people, in most environments, with most lenses, you would say that 1/25th is like a safe handheld shutter speed. So some camera systems have image stabilizer, which allows you to shoot with a low shutter speed, so that's great. Now, and some cameras don't. Now, some people generally shake as we get older. We find it harder to handhold, so it really depends on who you are and if you have the hands of a surgeon, or arguably if you shake or not. So you got to know your limits and try to fit between them there. Now, if you want a safe shutter speed, generally speaking, if your focal length of your lens, let's say, for example, a 50mm lens, some people would say, well, make sure your shutter speed exceeds your focal length. So if you have a 50mm lens, then you can go to 60 shutter speed. Some people will actually say, go double that. So for example, a 50mm lens, you might want to go to 100 speed or 125. I'll let you be the judge, and you've got to work it out for yourself. So as we go up to the fast shutter speed, of course we need more light. It'll freeze faster moving subjects and objects. So depending on the genre of photography that you're photographing, you will have to learn what will be within a range. For example, a bride and groom walking down the aisle, you might want to be about 250 or even possibly up to 400 to 500, depending on how fast they walk. If you're photographing, let's say, a tennis player, let's say just yielding a tennis racket and forehand, backhand, all that kind of stuff, you might be up to 2,000. And of course, if you go to motor racing, you might be in the 8,000 range. So you just got to work out what you want. And of course, if you're photographing, let's say, a waterfall, and you want to make it look all misty and beautiful and all that dreamy like sort of moving water, you might be around about the quarter, half a second, or a second and beyond. So again, depending on the genre that you're actually photographing, it really depends on what you want to do there. Okay, now aperture probably, arguably you would say, is the most important, because the shutter speed within a certain range and ISO within a certain range is, you don't really identify it as much in your camera unless you're at the you know, the longer exposures and the fast exposures, and if you're going extreme ISO, whatever. But the aperture really is where the magic happens. This controls the amount of light, as we said, on the sensor and how much in focus. And as we said before, we call it depth of field. As we open up, as the pupil, so to speak, is dilated, you know, to 1.4 or even beyond, like there's lenses now that have 0.95 and so on, there's less in focus. And of course, we need less light to achieve this. And then of course, you go to the f/22 range, we need more in focus and we need more light to achieve that. So when you look at this entire exposure triangle, once you determine what a good exposure is, according to the subject matter that you're photographing, if you change one thing, you have to change something else. And if you don't know what I'm speaking about right now, we'll actually discuss that in our practical demonstration. All right, guys, so there's the theory. The theory there is that we have three things that affect exposure, and of course we have different camera modes and metering modes and things like that, which we'll discuss in the field on location. But I wanted to give you a bit of a foundation, a bit of a theory to look at. And now we need to work out that, how do we determine the correct exposure? What modes do we use? What are the implications of changing white balances? And what are the implications of changing all these different things, and how do they harmonize together? So let's do this right now. Follow along with me, and don't forget, you've got to practice. Repetition, experience, and practice. All of these things will be your best teacher.